They taught us that the history of humanity is clear, linear, and well documented, that we know where we came from, who we were, and how it all began. But that's a comfortable lie, because before religions, before empires, before churches, temples, and doctrines, there was a time that was off, a time that doesn't appear in school textbooks, a time that is not preached from the pulpits, a time that is not discussed in seminars, a time when the gods were not invisible. They weren't far away. They were not symbolic. They walked among men, and what's most disturbing is that this doesn't stem from isolated myths or confused legends. It comes from official records, from clay tablets, administrative documents, royal lists, and state archives recorded more than 5,000 years ago. Texts that describe kings chosen by celestial entities, cities founded by divine order, laws delivered directly from heaven. It was a functional system where the human and the divine operated under the same power structure, and those texts were buried, hidden, reclassified, discredited, silenced. Not because they were wrong, but why did they say too much? Because they revealed a world that shouldn't be remembered, a world where faith didn't exist, because it existed presence, where there was no belief, because there was contact, where there was no intermediary, because the link was direct. What if that's true? If there ever was a time when heaven openly ruled the earth, then everything that came after, all religion, all of theology, the entire spiritual structure that we know today, it's just one reduced, controlled and reorganized version than what existed before, and that's exactly it that they never wanted you to know. Stay until the end. Because what you're about to hear, it doesn't just change history. It changes the way you understand God, power, knowledge, and the real reason why the link between heaven and earth was broken. The history of humanity as we know it today is a carefully edited construction, a narrative that feeds both on what has been preserved and what has been deliberately forgotten. When we look at Mesopotamia, we are not only facing the cradle of civilization, but also the first great archive of direct contact between the human and the divine. A vast, complex, and disturbingly detailed record of an era in which heaven and earth operated under the same system of authority, governance, and transmission of knowledge. And it is precisely here that the problem begins, because Mesopotamian texts do not speak of the divine as something distant, abstract, or symbolic. They describe a functional world where gods appointed kings, where cities were founded by celestial order, where laws were transmitted directly, where the link between the world of the gods and the world of men was not a belief, but a daily administrative structure. This record, this archaic testimony of an integrated world, was progressively erased, not out of ignorance, not by chance, but by the deliberate reorganization of religious power, by the centralization of knowledge, by the redefinition of what the people might or might not have known. Because history does not forget, it selects, and what was selected to disappear was not just clay tablets, but entire layers of understanding about the origin of human authority, about the real role of divine intermediaries, about the nature of forbidden knowledge, and about the exact moment when the link was broken, and remains until the end, because what will be revealed in the last records changes everything that came after. Changes the way we understand the Bible, changes the way we interpret the origin of religions, completely changes the meaning of the separation between sacred and profane, between heaven and earth, between God and man. And to understand the erasure, it is necessary first to reconstruct what existed before it. And the Sumerian and Akkadian texts preserve the memory of a time when the gods did not only inhabit temples or myths, they walked among men, founded cities, appointed rulers, established borders, dictated laws, organized society. And this presence was not sporadic or miraculous. It was constant, regulatory, almost bureaucratic. Kings did not rule by right. They ruled because they were chosen, instructed, and consecrated by entities operating above the human sphere. This relationship is documented in hundreds of texts, from the Sumerian king list, which categorically states that kingship descended from heaven, not as a metaphor, but as a historical description of a foundational event, to coronation hymns that describe kings being touched by the divine hand, receiving celestial insignia, hearing the voice of the gods in dreams, visions, and secret rituals performed inside ziggurats, far from the eyes of the people, far from public knowledge. This is not allegory. The texts do not say that the kings were inspired by the gods, but that the gods spoke to them, gave them specific orders, demanded accountability, punished disobedience, withdrew favor when a function was not fulfilled, observed, judged, and intervened directly in human history. This language is direct, concrete, and administrative. It does not resemble religious poetry, resembles official documentation, state reports, and governance records. When we cross-reference these records with early biblical tradition, we find undeniable echoes, the idea of walking with God, as Enoch did before being taken, the notion of hearing the Lord's voice, as Abraham heard it when commanded to leave his land, the concept of being called by name, as Moses was called at the burning bush. All of this presupposes a type of relationship that is not distant, not abstract, but present, functional, and conscious. Mesopotamian texts preserve precisely this layer. They show that before institutional faith, before religion as a systematized doctrine, before theology as intellectual speculation, there was contact, there was transmission, there was an operational system between heaven and earth. This system had clear rules, defined hierarchies, and specific intermediaries. Keep this information in mind because the role of these intermediaries is key to understanding why the link was broken, why knowledge was centralized, why access was restricted, and who these intermediaries were. The intermediaries, as described by Mesopotamian texts with disturbing clarity, were priest-kings who united political and spiritual power in a single figure. They were initiated sages who spent decades studying secret texts. They were consecrated scribes who copied tablets that would never be read by the common people. Chosen men who received direct access to divine knowledge, who participated in secret rituals in the heart of the temples, who preserved teachings that could not be transmitted to the masses. And this was not to protect the people from dangerous information, but to protect the power system that depended on the exclusive control of this knowledge. Because divine knowledge was not only spiritual, not only moral, it was technical, structural, revealing the workings of the cosmos, the origin of natural laws, the mechanism behind order and chaos, the relationship between celestial cycles and terrestrial events. And these men, these intermediaries, were not prophets in the modern sense of the word. They were not occasionally inspired by mystical visions. They were administrators of the link, functionaries of the celestial system, sacred bureaucrats who maintained communication between two worlds. And the texts describe how they entered the deepest temples, the inner sanctuaries where only the consecrated could tread, how they performed rituals that no one else could see, rituals involving specific objects, specific words, specific movements, how they received tablets engraved with knowledge that should not be shared, visions that should not be described, instructions that should not be questioned, and how they carried the psychological and spiritual burden of not being able to share everything they knew, because there were things that the people should not know, not out of divine malice, not out of the cruelty of the gods, but because knowledge fundamentally altered the power relationship, because knowing too much meant no longer needing mediators, no longer needing temples, no longer needing priests, and this prepares the ground for the next revelation, because the texts also preserve something even more disturbing. They consistently indicate that there were rigid limits imposed on human knowledge. invisible but absolute boundaries that could not be crossed, severe and immediate punishments for those who transgressed them. Borders, and these limits were not moral in the ethical sense we understand today. They weren't about good or evil. They were structural, functional. The problem was never ethical sin. It was access to the workings of the world. It was understanding how the system really operated. And there are fragments that describe the gods concerned with human advancement, with the growing capacity to build, to organize, to understand, to replicate knowledge that was previously exclusively divine. And this concern was not benevolent, it wasn't paternal, it was strategic, it was political, because autonomous humans who understand the laws behind reality, don't need intermediaries. They don't need temples that centralize knowledge. They don't need priests who interpret the divine will. They can access directly. They can operate directly. And the divine link began to be broken precisely when man learned too much, when he began to replicate knowledge that should remain exclusive, when he began to question instead of just obeying. And the records indicate this clearly and disturbingly. There are texts that speak of a golden age, a primordial time when gods and men coexisted, without barriers, followed by a progressive distancing, by a systematic reduction of divine appearances, by a growing silence that settled like a fog over human history. And this silence was not accidental. It was not the natural result of spiritual evolution. It was structural, it was planned. It was the result of a deliberate reorganization of the system, because maintaining the direct link with all of humanity was unsustainable. From the point of view of control, it was dangerous for the maintenance of hierarchies. It was uncontrollable for those who depended on mediation as a source of power. So the system changed radically. The gods stopped walking among men as they did in primordial times. The cities stopped receiving direct instructions as they did during the original foundations. The kings stopped hearing clear voices as they did during the first reigns. And instead, power was progressively transferred to human institutions, to organized priesthoods that created complex internal hierarchies, to temples that became centers of economic and political power, to religious hierarchies that interpreted the divine will instead of transmitting it directly, that translated instead of repeating, they filtered instead of revealing. And this transition is meticulously documented, not only in Mesopotamia, but also in the biblical tradition when read with chronological attention. Just observe how God speaks constantly and directly to Adam in the garden, conversing face to face, walking alongside the man in the evening breeze. How he speaks to Noah, giving precise instructions on the construction of the ark. Exact measurements, specific materials, detailed procedures, how he speaks to Abraham, establishing covenants and revealing future plans, how he speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai, delivering not only laws, but explanations about the workings of the cosmos, about the structure of the tabernacle that reflects the celestial structure. And then, progressively, these direct conversations become rarer, more mediated by extraordinary circumstances, more institutional rather than personal, until in the era of the kings of Israel, God hardly speaks directly to anyone anymore, and when he does, it is always through prophets, never directly to the people, never in everyday conversations, never in a way accessible to the masses. And this is not spiritual evolution, as traditional theology defines it. Those who like to interpret this as a reorganization of power, a deliberate centralization of access, institutional control of a link that was previously diffuse and accessible, and this process was not peaceful. It was not natural. It was accompanied by a systematic and deliberate erasure of everything that documented the old link. Everything that preserved the memory of a time when the divine was accessible, and here enters the second great movement of the history we are reconstructing. Because the Mesopotamian texts that describe this functional system, this direct contact, this integrated world where heaven and earth operated under the same rules, began to disappear systematically, not all at once as in a great fire or single catastrophe, but progressively, methodically. They were buried under layers of earth during the destruction of cities. They were fragmented during the reorganization of temples when new gods took control. They were reclassified as mythology by scribes of new empires who could not admit the existence of previous more direct systems, as superstition by priests of new religions who depended on institutional mediation to justify their power, like primitive narratives that shouldn't be taken seriously by scholars who couldn't accept that the ancient world operated under completely different paradigms from modern ones. And this didn't happen by chance. It wasn't the natural result of the passage of time or the inevitable deterioration of ancient materials. It happened because new empires arose with new gods and new theologies that needed to erase the past to legitimize the present, because new religious systems consolidated that couldn't coexist with the memory of previous, more horizontal systems. And these systems couldn't allow the people easy access to the memory of a time when the divine was accessible without mandatory intermediaries, when kings spoke directly with gods without needing priests interpreting dreams or mediating rituals, when knowledge flowed more horizontally without passing through rigid institutional filters that decided what could or could not be known. Because this memory was an existential threat to the new system, it was living proof that the current system was a reduced, controlled, censored, filtered version of what existed before. It was historical evidence that there was a time when humanity had direct access to the divine, and this access was deliberately cut off, restricted, and institutionalized for reasons that had more to do with political control than with spiritual need. The texts were then buried, literally covered by earth and oblivion. Thousands of tablets were left under the ruins of temples destroyed during military conquests, under the rubble of cities abandoned after changes of power, under layers of later constructions that physically erased the ancient structures, and with them the memory of what they represented. When these tablets were rediscovered centuries and millennia later by 19th and 20th century European archaeologists excavating Mesopotamian ruins, they were immediately treated as archaeological curiosities, as interesting but not factual myths, as creative religious literature but never as historical records of a real system that actually operated. This treatment was not naive. It was not merely the result of scientific prejudices of the Victorian era. It was strategic, even if unconsciously. It was a continuation of the same impulse that originally buried the texts. Because recognizing these texts as factual records of a true system would acknowledge that there was a specific time in human history when humanity operated under a completely different paradigm, a paradigm where the divine was not an object of faith, but of direct and verifiable experience, where religion was not belief but transmitted knowledge, where the separation between heaven and earth was not absolute and ontological, but administrative and functional. This destroys the fundamental basis of all subsequent religious systems, of all the theology carefully developed over the last 2,000 years, systems that essentially depend on mandatory institutional mediation, on interpretation authorized by accredited experts, on blind faith as the supreme virtue, precisely because direct knowledge is no longer available. Therefore, the erasure, the systematic reclassification, the literal and metaphorical burial of these inconvenient records, because they could not coexist with the religious world that was later built upon their ruins. And yet, despite all meticulous efforts, despite centuries of deliberate burial and forced oblivion, important fragments survived, broken tablets preserved by the chance of archaeology or by the surprising resistance of the clay material, indirect quotations in later texts that they could not avoid mentioning ancient traditions even when trying to discredit them, biblical parallels that unknowingly repeat much older narratives of Mesopotamian origin, and these scattered fragments, when gathered with methodological patience and rigorous academic method, allow us to reconstruct significant parts of the missing link. Not completely, not with all the original details, but enough to understand that something real existed, something functional operated, something historical, connected heaven and earth in a direct, conscious and operational way, and what remained was enough to indicate with increasing clarity what existed, to show that we are not dealing with primitive fantasies of naive peoples, but with the preserved historical memory of a system that actually operated during a specific period. And when we gather these geographically and temporally dispersed fragments, when we methodically cross-reference the Mesopotamian texts with the canonical biblical tradition, with the apocryphal texts that were deliberately excluded from the official canon, with the pseudepigrapha that preserve even older and more disturbing traditions, with the oral traditions that, as they survived in isolated communities in the Middle East, a coherent and profoundly disturbing image begins to emerge. The image of a world where the divine was not transcendent in the modern sense of the word, not something completely separate and inaccessible by definition, but immanent, present, active in everyday human life in concrete ways, where the separation between heaven and earth was not absolute and insurmountable by nature, but administrative and functional, a matter of hierarchy and not ontology, where the link between the two worlds was not mystical and incomprehensible by essence, but functional and operated under specific rules that could be known and followed. And this central revelation changes everything, completely changes the way we read the Bible when we return to it with this knowledge, because it means that the biblical narrative is not describing the absolute beginning of divine contact with humanity, but is inheriting and continuing a world already deeply conscious of the divine, already structured by centuries or even millennia of systematic contact, already organized by a complex system that had been operating long before Abraham left Ur, long before Moses ascended Sinai, long before the people of Israel. To exist as a distinct historical entity, and Mesopotamia preserves the raw memory of this earlier and more ancient system without the sophisticated theological layers that were later added by the Judeo-Christian tradition, without the reinterpretations that softened aspects considered disturbing, without the institutional filters that removed elements that did not fit into the approved official narrative. And when we read the two sets of texts side by side, when we allow them to illuminate each other without forcing artificial agreements or forced harmonizations, we realize that both are essentially talking about the same thing, are describing the same historical phenomenon from different cultural angles, are preserving independent memories of the same fundamental time when heaven and earth were not separated as they are now, are documenting in distinct ways a link that was real, that was functional, that was conscious on both sides of the relationship, and that was progressively veiled, not destroyed because truth cannot be completely destroyed, but hidden under successive layers of theological reinterpretation, covered by centuries of religious reorganization that preferred institutional mediation to disturbing direct contact. Buried for millennia of the centralization of spiritual power, could not tolerate the democratic memory of a freer and more accessible time, because the divine link did not truly disappear from history. It was deliberately veiled by human decisions, carefully covered by layers of interpretation that distorted the original meaning of the texts, by centuries of religious reorganization that systematically transferred power from the direct link to mediating institutions, by millennia of progressive centralization that transformed verifiable experience into doctrine that must be accepted and direct contact into faith that must be maintained even without evidence. But the historical memory remains, fragmented and scattered like pieces of an immense and complex puzzle buried under physical ruins. These are images of destroyed cities and metaphorical examples of abandoned paradigms, yet still accessible to those who know where to look in libraries and museums, to those with the methodological patience to gather the scattered fragments, to those intellectually willing to question the official narratives we have been taught. Understanding these ancient and fragmented records does not destroy faith, as some conservative theologians defensively fear. On the contrary, it profoundly expands biblical reading when done with intellectual honesty, adds layers of historical meaning that have been artificially lost, restores archaeological depth to the human past that has been artificially flattened by centuries of simplification, reconnects the modern reader with a much older and richer layer of human religious experience. A layer where the divine was not primarily an object of abstract belief, but of direct and verifiable contact, where the relationship between God and humanity was not primarily theological and speculative, but administrative and functional, where sacred knowledge was not revealed through systematized doctrines to be memorized, but transmitted through direct connection and personal instruction that could be experienced. And this ancient and primordial link, the original system that preceded everything else, perfectly explains why humanity has always instinctively known that it was not alone in the universe, why all cultures on all continents preserve curiously similar memories of a time when the gods physically walked among men, why the Hebrew Bible begins its foundational narrative with God casually conversing with Adam in the Garden of Eden as if it were the most natural thing in the world and not an extraordinary event. Why Mesopotamian texts describe kings physically receiving crowns from the hands of the gods in ceremonies that were not symbolic but real and witnessed. Why the entire ancient world, from one end of the globe to the other, operated under the unquestionable fundamental premise that heaven and earth were connected by a real and functional link that could be accessed. And this universal premise was not the naivete of primitive peoples who could not distinguish reality from fantasy as modern rationalism likes to suppose. It was not the superstition of pre-scientific minds that attributed to the gods what they could not naturally explain. It was the preserved collective memory, carefully through countless generations, a system that truly existed historically, that truly functioned operationally during a specific period of human history, and that was deliberately and systematically dismantled and erased because it could not coexist with the new power systems that emerged after the great imperial reorganizations. Systems that fundamentally depended on mandatory institutional mediation, on the ontological distance between the divine and the human, on the centralized and hierarchical control of access to the sacred. Therefore, the Mesopotamian records were buried with such systematic care. Therefore, the texts were fragmented and geographically dispersed. Therefore, the official narrative was simplified and purged of elements considered disturbing or dangerous, because the complete and unfiltered truth was too dangerous to be allowed to circulate freely. It revealed too much about how religious power truly functions structurally. It connected the controlled present too much with a free past that should remain perpetually forgotten. And what was systematically erased through the centuries was not merely neutral historical information, not merely data on chronology or isolated events, but the living and operational memory of a world completely different from our own, a radically distinct paradigm where the human and the divine operated under the same metaphorical roof, under the same basic rules of interaction, under the same integrated and mutually conscious system. Recovering this buried and fragmented memory is not heresy against faith, as some fearfully warn. It is spiritual archaeology in the deepest and most legitimate sense. It is honestly recognizing that human history is far deeper and more complex than modern systems comfortably allow us to admit, far more organically connected to the divine than contemporary theology can process without contradiction, far more aware of higher realities than scientific materialism can accept without collapsing. This fundamental detail completely alters the traditional narrative that has been carefully taught to us, because if the link truly existed historically, if it was objectively real and not mythological, if it was functionally operational and not merely symbolic, then everything that came after in religious history, all the complex theological structure that was developed, all the elaborate systematic doctrine that was refined, all the sophisticated institutional religious structure we know today is in fact a drastically reduced version of the original, a version carefully controlled by vested interests. Institutional versions deliberately conceal the disturbing fact that there was a specific time in history when it wasn't necessary to believe because it was possible to know directly through experience. It wasn't necessary to have blind faith because it was possible to personally hear divine instructions. It wasn't necessary to trust institutional intermediaries because it was possible to see with one's own eyes and verify personally. The erased and fragmented Mesopotamian records preserve precisely this inconvenient and disturbing memory. The memory of the direct divine link that the contemporary world shouldn't know, because knowing inevitably means questioning current structures, naturally comparing what exists now with what existed before, and perceiving the differences. Realizing that the current system is not the only possible one, nor necessarily the most spiritually complete, not the closest to the historical origin, nor the most faithful to the primordial paradigm that actually existed. Therefore, it was systematically erased through successive reorganizations, carefully veiled by layers of theological reinterpretation, strategically mythologized to remove its historical force, but crucially never completely destroyed, because certain truths are resilient, because truth, when recorded in durable clay that withstands millennia, when engraved in a resilient stone that survives civilizations, when preserved in collective memory, faithfully transmitted through successive generations, does not completely disappear even under the most determined and systematic efforts of erasure. It merely waits patiently, buried under layers of earth and time, to be rediscovered by those with trained eyes to see through reinterpretations and the intellectual courage to question official narratives. And now, faced with these fragments laboriously gathered through decades of archaeological work, faced with this careful and methodical reconstruction made through rigorous textual analysis, it becomes absolutely clear to anyone examining the evidence that the link did in fact exist historically, that it was objectively real and not merely mythological as some have tried to make us believe, that it was consciously maintained and operated by both sides of the divine-human relationship, and that its progressive concealment through the centuries was by no means accidental or natural, but absolutely necessary and strategic for the construction and maintenance of the institutional religious world we know today. A world that structurally and essentially depends on the insurmountable distance between the divine and the human, on the mandatory institutional mediation by accredited specialists, on faith as the supreme virtue precisely because direct contact is no longer available for validation. And fundamentally, one cannot admit without self-destruction that there was a documented time in history when none of this was necessary or relevant, because the divine was present in an accessible and verifiable way, available without mandatory intermediaries controlling access, functional within a system that any properly prepared and consecrated person could access directly. And this is the final and most profoundly disturbing revelation that the erased Mesopotamian records carry through the millennia to us. The revelation that the direct divine link is not a comforting fantasy invented by primitive minds, not a poetic metaphor created by religious poets, not an unattainable mystical aspiration of dreamy mystics. It is the carefully preserved historical memory, despite everything, of a system that actually existed and operated functionally during a specific period of documented human history, and which was deliberately and systematically erased through successive reorganizations of power because it revealed too much about the true, mutable nature of the relationship between heaven and earth, because it exposed too much about how religious power was artificially reorganized for institutional benefit, because it connected too closely the forgotten and free past with the controlled and mediated present, and because in the end it proved beyond doubt that the world as we know it now is not as it always was from the beginning, that there was a radically different and more direct before that was deliberately erased, and that perhaps, just perhaps, if we honestly understand what was lost, there might be an equally transformed after where the link is once again recognized and restored.